Well, friends, I have Dr. Maurice Robinson on again with us, and I want him to react to a video that I saw recently on YouTube. We've responded once to Dr. Bart Ehrman, but this is more specific in regards to the woman who's caught in adultery. I have a one of the world's foremost experts really on that section as far as Greek manuscripts are concerned. Pretty much every available manuscript in Greek he has examined and looked at in regards to this particular story in John 8. And so I want to get his reaction to this clip from Bart Ehrman. Are you okay with that, Dr. Robinson?
Oh, I'm always happy to respond to various clips. Go right ahead.
Okay, all right. Well, let me see if I can get my screen shared here, and then we'll go to the video.
The reality is some of the favorite passages that we know in the Bible that are among my favorite passages are almost certainly not originally there. You know, the famous story of Jesus and the woman taken in adultery. I think it's got to be the most famous story in the Gospels. This is a fantastic story. This is a wonderful story. It's a great story, but it's not in any of the old manuscripts of the Gospel of John. Church fathers who wrote commentaries on John don't know about it until the 12th century in Greek. So this is not a debated thing among scholars that this passage doesn't belong in the Gospel of John, or it's nowhere else in the New Testament. But you're still going to find it in your Bibles.
Okay, Dr. Robinson, that was Bart Ehrman talking about the famous Pericope Adulterae, the PA. What, as someone who's really examined a lot of these manuscripts, what would you say to his comments there?
Well, Bart and I know each other. In fact, I've had him speak to my text critical class back when I was still teaching at the seminary. And what he is saying in that very, very short clip is the same thing that he has been saying in his books, such as Misquoting Jesus, or even in published scholarly articles. That he even had one that dealt with the story of the adulteress. And I have no objection to what he's saying from the point of view of the normal scholarly text critical community. By and large, the PA, pericope adulterae, woman caught in adultery passage, is generally rejected in the scholarly text critical community. It is considered a later insertion into the Gospel of John for various reasons, and you can find these in most commentaries that are out there. So again, he's not saying anything new. Now, when he says, for example, that it's not found in any Greek commentary until you get to the 12th century, and that's Eusebius Agabinus, yeah, that's correct, but it is found in Latin commentaries that are going all the way back to the time of Ambrose, for example, and others, Augustine, Ambrose. Jerome says it's found in the 4th century in many copies. He's talking about copies of the Gospels, both Greek and Latin. It's a little hard to argue with those facts, but it's easy not to mention those if they aren't pertinent to the issue. But in Greek, you also have, and Ehrman knows this quite well, you've got not only the apostolic constitutions relate to the story, they aren't quoting it directly, and they aren't saying that it came from John, but they certainly are citing the story. And this is even coming from the Didascalia. And you also have what Ehrman himself specifically studied, which was the text of Didymus the Blind. And Didymus the Blind in the 4th century is also relating to that same story, which Didymus says, he found in various gospels. Now, that could mean in more than one different gospel by different people, or it could mean in various manuscripts themselves that might be only of one gospel, but they never say it's from John, which is fine, and you can say that, but the question is, if it's not from John, where did it come from? Papias talked about the gospel according to the Hebrews, which we don't have, whatever that was, which is apparently a collection of the sayings and deeds of Jesus. and there was a woman that was accused of many sins that was brought to Jesus. It doesn't say adultery. It doesn't even say that it's the woman caught in adultery passage. Some people say, well, that points to the Gospel of the Hebrews as being the source for the woman in adultery. But it could just as easily be what Eusebius is talking about through Papias. Papias might be talking just about the woman in Luke 7:36 through 50, which was the sinner that was brought into the door between Jesus and the Pharisee. So uh, I wouldn't really use Papias for any purpose in this, but nevertheless, there is Greek evidence for the woman in adultery passage. Even if it's not cited as to being from John, the implication is, absent other evidence, that's probably where it is coming from. Now, Bart and I will disagree on that, I'm sure, but nevertheless, that's what he says. It's not much different than what anybody else says. You can go to the more evangelical people. Dan Wallace would be saying virtually the same thing, but that doesn't surprise me at all because, again, the bulk of scholars in text criticism, whether they are liberal, conservative, in the middle, uh, generally hold to the secondary nature of the woman in the passage and its insertion into that passage, which I and Byzantine majority text type people would reject. We consider the passage to be original to John, and we give our reasons elsewhere. We don't want to go into all of that, or we'll be talking for a long time.
Yeah, no, that's good. But what gets me about this though, as someone who, if you're not very versed in this, so you listen to Ehrman, he gave me the impression that he gave me the impression that he was saying that no church father till whatever it was, he said the 10th or 12th, whatever it was that he said there, no one talks about this. Is kind of the impression I walked away after I heard him. But what he's done is he's carefully calibrated his statement so that it's technically accurate. But like you say, obviously, uh, am I mistaken in thinking you mentioned Augustine? Doesn't Augustine say that he thinks that people have been taking it out because they think it might lead
Well,
to
no,
a lax attitude towards adultery or something like that? I'm paraphrasing drastically, but something along those
no,
lines.
Augustine did say that. Augustine did say that, but Ehrman carefully qualified his statement and say no Greek father until the 12th century. Augustine, Ambrose, Jerome are predominantly Latin fathers. So they don't count if you want to say you're looking for Greek fathers, but that's why I would say even when he says only Eusebius Zigabinus of the 11th or 12th century is actually commenting on it, that is true because even the apostolic constitutions and the Didascalia, even though they are referencing the event, they are not saying, by the way, this is a commentary on the Gospel of John or even a commentary on that passage. They're just saying, here is the event, and what we should draw from this event is we should not be quick to condemn, but to forgive. And that's what both apostolic constitutions and Didascalia are saying. And even Didymus the Blind is not commenting specifically on the text, but on the event. So
Yeah.
technically, Ehrman is correct, but the fact is there are Greek sources that point to the pericope adulterae actually being known all the way to at least the 4th century. And by the way, if you get the book To Cast the First Stone by Jennifer Knust and Tommy Wasserman, they are very clear on this, that this story was known as early, as far as we can tell, as the 2nd century AD. And then you've got other people who are saying that because of the use of certain phrases in the apocryphal Protevangelium Jacobi, the infancy narrative of James, certain of the expressions that are in there came right out of the pericope adulterae, and very likely, according to the conclusion in the article that I'm referencing, very likely implies that whoever wrote the apocryphal narrative had access to a copy of the Gospel of John in which the pericope adulteri was already present in sometime in the 2nd century.
Yeah, that's
So all of this gives strong evidence toward it, and not the selective evidence which can be done by uh, leaving out inconvenient material.
yeah, that's good. What was interesting to me is he said that no, there were no old Greek manuscripts that included it. I'm assuming you have to define old very narrowly to make that work too. Uh,
He means from this certainly none of the papyri and none of the early manuscripts up to, say, the time of maybe the late 5th century that we have in our extant data contain that passage. That's true. However, what he doesn't point out, or anybody that says the oldest and the best manuscripts or whatever, there aren't all that many of them. If you're talking about the manuscripts that we actually possess that would contain the area where the pericope adultera ought to go, but leave it out, we're talking about, let me count, P66, P75, those are the only papyri at that portion, Aleph, and B. There's your manuscripts up to the 4th century, 4 of them.
yeah,
We don't have that much data in that early period uh, to establish enough to tabulate from, because whatever was on the papyri later got destroyed, wore out, or whatever, and the uncials replaced them. And once you get into the uncial era, yes, the 4th century uncials don't have them. Even in the 5th century, Codex A and C, Alexandrinus and Ephraemi Scriptus, apparently they're missing pages, but they probably didn't have it. But by the time you get to the middle or late 5th century, we start seeing uncial manuscripts with it all the way up to the time of the minuscule era. And when you start, if you were counting noses, which isn't the way to do textual criticism, you actually have just about as many uncial manuscripts containing the pericope adulteri as you do uncial manuscripts that omit it, that actually have the passage location in place. You can't just go to an uncial named 248 or something like that. I'm making that up. But if you had 0248 and it doesn't have the pericope in it, and you say, well, that's one that should count against it, what if 0248 only contains part of the Gospel of Matthew? See, you can't just say we've got 330 something unsealed manuscripts. We don't have, but maybe about 30 altogether that have the region where the pericope adulteri should fit in, and about half of them don't have it, and the other half do. So that's where the real statistics fit in. And I can give you the details. But again, it would take us off on a further rabbit trail on that.
well, here's what's interesting. So he marshaled two or three lines of evidence. In that short clip, I'm sure he could expand on as well as you could, but he gives evidence from the church fathers. But he gives us highly selected information about the church fathers, and he doesn't tell you about
Right.
Augustine. He doesn't tell you about the Latin fathers. He says, "Oh, well,
Right.
it's none of the old manuscripts," and you find out, oh, he's actually talking about only 4. Okay, and then he says, but no scholar takes this seriously. But he's talking about his guys, like a selected group of scholars, because I'm talking to a man, Dr. Robinson, who has been you've done something that I don't think you can correct me on this. No one else on the planet has ever done this. Collated every manuscript you could get your hands on or that you could see on this passage. I think that
On this
qualifies you.
particular passage, right.
That qualifies you for an expert on it. So I'm talking and I know you're not saying this, Dr. Robinson, so you could plug your ears here if you want to, but I'm talking to the world's foremost authority on the PA. I'm talking to the world's foremost authority on the PA, and he says it's original. So he's selective on the fathers, he's selective on the old manuscript, and he's selective everywhere you turn on how he's presented the evidence. And what's interesting to me, this is not a New Testament textual critic, but this is N.T. Wright, and he is by no means a conservative, much more liberal than you and I would be on our view of Scripture. But he's willing to say, and he kind of waffles on this, but he's saying the earliest manuscripts omit the passage, and some later ones place it at different points in John and even in Luke. That's something that we could maybe discuss some other time. That's a little misleading. This doesn't mean it didn't happen. It might be that the story was thought so radical that some early scribes left it out. So even a man like N.T. Wright, who again is not by any means a conservative, is willing to say, you know what, maybe some scribes took it out. So when he says no scholar, this is uncontroversial in scholarship, you have to be very selective about which scholars you're talking about.
Let me address the church fathers issue again with the Latin fathers. We talked about Ambrose and Augustine. They actually are commenting on the passage. Jerome creates the Latin Vulgate. Even though he's not writing a commentary, he includes the pericope in the Vulgate. But what is also probably more important is there are a certain number of Old Latin manuscripts that have the pericope present, as well as some Old Latin manuscripts that do not include the pericope. And in fact, my former student, Jonathan Borland, did his master's thesis on the Old Latin manuscripts that did contain the pericope. And it's generally considered that even though the Old Latin manuscripts are themselves somewhat late, they are reflecting a text that, because it is non-Vulgate, goes back probably to the 2nd century. Again, we're back to that issue, and that means it was in manuscripts, the Old Latin, from the 2nd century, 3rd century time period. And since it's in these Old Latin manuscripts, the issue becomes, well, where did they come about from? They were translated by somebody from Greek manuscripts. Yeah. Unless you're thinking the Latin is original, which it's not. If the Greek is original, the Old Latin manuscripts that have the pericope present were translated from some Greek manuscript that apparently existed already in the 2nd century. So again, you can raise the objections. And by the way, we're not going to go into all the detail on it, but all the other locations for the pericope, Chris Keith, who also does not hold to originality of the pericope, has made it very clear in his article on the initial location of the pericope that there is not one manuscript before the 10th century AD that relocates it to a different place, whether to the end of John, whether to the Gospel of Luke, or anything else. And he said, basically, you can write those off as trying to claim that the pericope is some sort of floating tradition, or that it just didn't belong and scribes were guessing and all of that. Keith's conclusion was very specific. From the earliest period that we can tell, the pericope adultera appeared, even though he thinks it's an interpolation, primarily and only until the 10th century, right there in the Gospel of John from chapter 753 through 811. And I enjoy dealing with Chris Keith because he wrote a whole book on the pericope adulterae. And if you leave out the parts where he's talking about he thinks it's an interpolation, everything else in his book gives you all the reasons possible for thinking it's original.
Yeah.
Internal reasons as well as external reasons. So I think he's done a great service for my position, even though he totally disagrees with it.
Yeah, the
and
investigation.
So anybody also.
Sorry about that, but the investigation I've done on this idea of it a floating tradition, it's a red herring, and it really shouldn't be brought up to lay people, because if you don't understand what's going on and you don't realize that's not happening in the 10th century, it's not a serious point as far as I'm concerned. But all of my expertise from I have a journeyman plumber's license, so no one has to take me as an expert on this. But I have talked to some people who are pretty knowledgeable about it, and I think this whole floating tradition thing is just a mute point, really.
Well, it's overstated, and yet it's in just about every commentary that's out there.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that because of Chris Keith's article on it, that maybe they won't bother mentioning it so much in the commentaries as if that's a proof of non-originality. And by the way, if it were a floating tradition, this is with the quotes and all of that, why would it, as a floating tradition, have the passage from 753 through 8:1? You don't just start a floating tradition with, and everybody went home. Strange thing to start. And then it has to get the setting, and then you have the next morning, early the next morning, Jesus comes to the temple. Okay, and he starts to teach the people. And again, why is that necessary early the next morning? Early in the morning he came. Why not just start with saying one time when Jesus was in the temple? This is like a once upon a time story. Once upon a time when Jesus was teaching in the temple, the scribes and Pharisees brought to him a woman that was taken in adultery. That's where a floating tradition could start. But it doesn't start with everybody went home.
Nope. Even a just a lay person with a plumbing license can understand that, Dr. Robinson. I think you've broken it down quite well for us, and I think the bottom line is if you cherry pick your data, you can make anything sound really convincing. But if you really get the whole picture, there's a lot more to this and a lot more evidence than Dr. Ehrman let on. So, anyways.
Absolutely.
It's been great having you, Dr. Robinson. Thank you for sharing your insights on this and your expertise, and I'll be looking forward to talking to you again.
Always happy to do it.
All right. Thanks.